Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this lunchtime seminar. It is the first lunchtime seminar of this academic year for the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And this lunchtime seminar series has been running for about 3 decades. And so we are very happy that you've joined us yet another academic year. Today, our event, Legacies of Indenture, Gendered Violence, Afro-Asian Intimacies, and Gyal Feminisms, I think promises to be a really interesting and lively conversation. And I hope all of you can contribute and join not only with your questions, but also with your comments, your lived experiences, and your perspectives. Our panelists, my name is Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. I'm Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. Welcome on behalf of the IGDS. Our panelists today are Ryan Persadie, Premika Leo, and Kirby Moses, and I'll be telling you a little bit about them as we go on in the seminar. Today we have a very special part of this series, which is a film screening of a film that was co-directed and co-produced by Ryan Persadie and Premika Leo. And we will be engaging in a discussion about the film that explores indenture in terms of its legacies of violence against women in the Caribbean. And we hope to open space for considering the post-indenture, post-slavery, post-indenture history of Afro-Asian intimacies, connection, and relationalities, and also offering an example of how performance arenas and multiracial feminist conversations can co-create the afterlife of indenture, both in the region and in its diaspora. This lunchtime seminar today is being co-hosted by our partner organization, Feminitt. Feminitt is a youth-led Caribbean feminist organization based in Trinidad and Tobago, working to advance the sexual and reproductive health and rights and justice, as well as working to advance comprehensive sexuality education. And they have been particularly effective in terms of working with young women on a range of issues, including path-breaking research on period poverty. I'd like to start off by inviting Kirby Moses. Kirby Moses is the Community Liaison Officer of Feminitt, and I'll read Kirby's bio now. Kirby is a poet, multidisciplinary artist, and decolonial feminist. As the Community Liaison Officer for the Safe Cycle Initiative by Feminitt Caribbean, she and Feminitt and the community leaders that they engage are working toward ending period poverty. She holds a diploma in global leadership from the UN University for Peace and is pursuing a Bachelor of Laws at the UWI St. Augustine, where she also serves as the Gender Affairs Officer of the Guild of Students. This is the Gender Affairs Officer position was created for the first time and filled for the first time last year. So Kirby is the second person in the 75 year history of the UWI to hold that post, and the Gender Affairs Officer post was created by undergraduate students of the IGDS who are part of the IGDS Ignite undergraduate social justice mentorship program. So we're very happy that Kirby is filling that post as well. She enjoys baking, painting, and dancing, and also community engagement for positive change. So Kirby, I'm just going to hand over to you so that you can welcome everyone on behalf of Feminitt, our partner organization.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today. As Dr. Hosein said, this is going to be a really, really inspiring and moving session, and I hope you all take what you all need to take from it. I'm here representing Feminitt today, and Feminitt Caribbean found it really important to be a part of this conversation as a youth-led feminist organization. as we are working to create a more inclusive and just Trinidad and Tobago. And we are constantly looking for new avenues to learn about our past so that we could plan and strategize for the future. Because the future is one that we want to be more equitable. We want a future that is more diverse, that is truly inclusive and progressive. And we know that Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean has had a very difficult past, but that continues to affect us to this day. But we are hopeful that the work that we are doing now, the work that other organizations and individuals are doing, will contribute to the future that we imagine. And as a Caribbean feminist organization, we need to unpack these histories. We need to come together in solidarity so that we could have what might be difficult conversations, but we need to have them in a safe space. And that is what we know today is. So this is a safe space for us to tell each other that I see you, I hear you, I understand you, and I am with you. So I hope that you all enjoy this session. And thanks again for being here. We'll hear from me again later.
Thanks so much, Kirby. The Institute for Gender and Development Studies is 30 years old, and over this time has contributed in a significant way to the study of indenture and post-indenture gendered realities, gendered and sexed realities in the region, starting with the work within the IGDS of Professor Rhoda Reddock and Professor Patricia Mohammed. And that work has continued over the decades. As some of you may know, one of our edited collections that we put out in the IGDS, which has publications in it by all of the faculty of the IGDS, is the collection Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, where we continue to navigate what it means to think about the afterlife of indenture and to think about it in terms of not just gender relations, but cross-race intimacies and solidarities. And so today's session continues that history of scholarship and engagement in the IGDS, and is just one of what I hope will be a series of sessions where we continue to have these conversations. I'd like to very quickly hand over to our first speakers, Ryan Persadie and Premika Leo. I'll introduce them and hand quickly over so that they can introduce the film. Ryan Persadie is an artist, educator, and writer from Toronto, Canada. Currently, he is a doctoral candidate in women and gender studies and sexual diversity studies and visiting assistant professor in gender, sexuality, and intersectionality studies at Connecticut College. His aesthetic and scholarly work investigates queer Caribbean diasporas, transnational feminisms and sexualities, performance, and Afro-Asian intimacies. He also performs as a drag artist, where he goes by the stage name of Tifa Wine. And Tifa Wine has performed across Canada, the US, the Caribbean, and can be found on Instagram at tifa.wine. Premika Leo of the Geetika Dance Company is an international choreographer, actor, musician, and dance archivist. She's been featured in American and Canadian television series and in commercials, with some examples being World Literacy, the Toronto Raptors, and FIFA. She has taught at the Geetika Dance Company in Toronto for almost 2 decades, performing mostly in Canada, the United States, the Bahamas, and Guyana. She's also a Caribbean woman from multiple locations in the region, specializing in Odissi, Nagara, and aerial cirque. Premika archives work regarding forms of Guyanese folk dance and its histories. Premika and Ryan were the co-directors and co-producers of the film we'll be screening today, and so I hand over to you to introduce the film.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hosein. Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, great. Okay, just double checking. So thank you so much. This is super exciting for both myself and Premika, because this is actually the first screening of the film in the Caribbean region ever. So this is really exciting for me on a personal note. My dad is from Trinidad and Tobago. My dad was born and raised in San Fernando. And I haven't been to Trinidad since I was like 5 years old. So I think I speak for me and Premika both, that we both wish we were there in person. But obviously we couldn't be there. So we appreciate, everyone sort of building this space, and really thankful to IGDS and Gabrielle, Hosein, and Ashley and Kirby and everyone, Catherine, everyone sort of helped us to make this possible. And hopefully in the future, we'll actually be able to gather in person and sort of do that work together. But for now, I only have a couple minutes. And so I just wanted to sort of introduce what you're going to see today before I hand it off to Premika, just to give you some context about the process and sort of this work that we've built together. Okay. Can everyone see this okay? Okay. So a couple of years ago, in 2018, I began a project that I called at the time, which was tentatively, but the name has stuck, Kuliween. And Kuliween was really invested in sort of thinking about histories and traditions and legacies of the grotesque and the horrific and the paranormal that are caught up in the Caribbean region and its diasporic imaginaries. And to think about sort of this double bind of pain and pleasure that really lives in this space of Caribbean feminist lives and Caribbean feminist politics. And so the series originally began by thinking with figures of the paranormal, like the Sukoyan, like the Churayal, all these sorts of stories and folkloric elements that we sort of grow up hearing about and maybe being scared of, right? And I was wanting to think about sort of the capacity of the monstrous and the grotesque and the sort of archive of pleasure and celebration and also horror that's sort of caught up in a lot of the sort of festivities that emerged out of the Caribbean, and sort of this double bind of pain and pleasure became really important for us. And so my early work in this project was seen here. So this piece was originally called the Adram Narayans, which was a play on the Addams family. And here I'm pictured with a bunch of organizers, women and agitators, right, decolonial agitators in Toronto that I've had the pleasure of being friends with and building community with. And we were thinking at the time about what would it mean to sort of hold place. And I was particularly thinking about, Andal Gosein's work with the family archive, and particularly the indentured photograph. And we sort of all grew up with these pictures in our grandparents' homes of these really serious looking Indo-Caribbean family units, and thinking about, what was sort of happening there with the emergence of the photo studio in Trinidad. And I sort of wanted to give life to this sort of pain and pleasure sort of element that lives in that sort of family photograph. And so I'm pictured here with my friends and community members, Suzanne Narain, who's right beside me, who's wearing makeup that was influenced by the sort of bad Beatty trope that was really famous online in the 2018-2019, which was using sort of South Asian, Indo-Caribbean, and Desi sort of frames to think about the skull, right, in this context. My friend Aruna Budram, who's a longtime organizer in Toronto, Canada, is shown in the middle, and she was actually pregnant with her child at the time, Surya. And so this piece was also meant to think about the capacities for joy that live in queer and trans mothering. And again, you're seeing all of our sort of makeups have this very sort of dark and grotesque element, right? But again, to sort of speak to the intimacies of the monstrous that have been bound up in the figure of the Indo-Caribbean woman, but also sort of how sort of living in that monstrous place also provides us with the capacity for transgression and joy and togetherness. And again, these were paired, that very serious image was paired with also images of everyday placemaking and everyday celebrations. So this was a shot in a kitchen where we were, again, mashing up each other and making roti and sort of living in this sort of celebratory space while having this very grotesque makeup on. Right, and again, showing you these sorts of everyday moments of togetherness and sort of bacchanal that are happening here. Last year, I produced this one with a longtime collaborator and artist from Toronto, Afro-Jamaican drag king, who goes by the stage name of Buster Hyman. And there's this, me and Buster Hyman have spent a long time organizing together, building party spaces together, thinking about the political potential of drag and sort of what it offers us. And we have this running joke in our organizing that we're a married heterosexual couple, right? Where I produced this piece with Buster called Dogla Love Story to think about the place of Indo-Caribbean feminism outside of Indo-Caribbean lives, and likewise for Afro-Caribbean feminism outside of Afro-Caribbean lives, and sort of these intimacies that mobilize across indentured and slavery discourses and the descendants of those historical processes. And so some of these shots were meant, again, to think about the intimacy. We're using this sort of imaginary marriage here to think about, again, this intimacy between pain and pleasure that is caught up within Dogla lives, Dogla intimacies, and Dogla mixtures, both in the Caribbean and its diasporas. Okay, and so just to sort of end here, the original piece that you're going to see in the film is a piece that I began working on in collaboration with Premika Leo and Anjali Shiraj, known as Tanti Feminisms. And in this piece, we were really largely inspired by the work of Gayatri Bahadur, in particular, a chapter in her book, Coolie Woman, entitled The Woman.
Ryan seems to have frozen. Oh, he's back. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I'm back. Okay. So I was largely invested in here and thinking about, again, this intimacy between pain.
It seems that Ryan may have frozen. Maybe he's having technical challenges in Toronto. Premika, we meet. Oh, you're back again. You want to try one finishing? And let's see if you could get through.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So maybe I'll just wrap up there. I'm not sure how much you heard. But again, this piece was largely, again, thinking about the afterlife of colonialism and the afterlife of the plantation that lives in geographies that, we now call in Canada and the States, New York, Brampton, Queens, etc. And I was also largely thinking about, at the time that I was producing this piece, and I brought it to Premika. Out of this afterlife of gendered violence is not just contained within the category of womanhood or those who identify as women, but sort of moves in and out of various structures of power. That becomes really
Ryan, it seems your mic is, your connection is coming in and out a little bit. So okay. I wonder do you have more slides that we could look at in your presentation?
No, I don't have more slides. That was it. Is it sounding better here?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So the last thing I said was I was just handing it off to Premika to offer some comments. Just if what I said wasn't able to.
Premika, I feel we have to go to you.
Okay, so I'll come in now. Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody on Zoom and anyone who's there in Trinidad. This is really exciting because I was always concerned about the content of this film and how it might come across, I was brought onto this project in collaboration with Ryan Persadie, to discuss and to bring authenticity to the film, because if there's one thing I hate, it's when diasporic people don't talk about things that they don't have experiences in. And I was pretty much brought in to bring in props, bring in set designers, my experience as an actor and all the networking I had done to take this from what was supposed to be originally an Instagram video to something a little bit more mainstream, which is film. It's just the industry that I do work in. And so I want to highlight the people who are not here in the Zoom today, who brought this to life, and who some are Caribbean, they're Caribbean adjacent. So Jessica Topham, Ryan O'Connor, who were our set designers and prop masters, who actually went into the Geetika Dance Archives, which is my company, which was started by Geeta Leo, and she has been protecting Guyanese folk dance and bringing archival pieces, artifacts into the into Canada, which I've kept safe since your passing, and we brought that into the film. So I want you guys to keep an eye out for the little details within the actual film, because some of these pieces, including things like jewelry or baskets, are, I mean, they're way older than me. So keep an eye out for that. Chad Shu is a Indigenous and Indo-Guyanese composer who composes music out here in Toronto. Vuk Dragujevic, who is our DOP, our director of photography. Anjali Shiraj, who created some of the wardrobe pieces, did the special effects, and is obviously one of the actors within the film. Photography, so any of the photos you just saw were done by Marshall Khan, and the poster itself was done by Andre Marshall, who is a new immigrant to Canada from Jamaica. So this was, it's beyond just, you know, the Indo-Caribbean. It's all hands on deck, people coming from different walks of life who are connected through the Caribbean, the West Indies. And so I will not keep you guys waiting. I will hand it off to Dr. Hosein, and please enjoy the film.
Actually, everyone, it's time to screen the film. So Ryan, I believe you're screening the film. Premika, maybe you can be on standby in case Ryan has tech challenges. And now it's time to screen the film.
Dawn DeJoy, Vanessa Bailey, Amwati Gyal, Ria Rajkumar, Stacey Singh, Vanessa Zaman, Christina Suktio, Ariana Gobardhan, Andrea Barat, Christina Yadram. The names listed here are just a mere fragment of the list upon lists of diasporic Indo-Caribbean women who have been injured, harmed, and murdered at the hands of heteropatriarchal power, whether that be in the form of their parents, community members, or even intimate partners. We know the names of these women not only because we hear about them in the news, but because we have seen these acts of death in multiple forms in our everyday lives and families, oftentimes passing through us generationally, physically, and emotionally, unsolved and unhealed. These forms of gendered, sexual, and racialized violence are not just contained to the realm of the past, history, and that which can be unheard, unseen, or unfelt today. Rather, these harms enacted upon the women mentioned above starkly remind us how the afterlife of colonialism and its violences are not really an afterlife at all, but a continuity, an ongoing maintenance, and a harmful lingering of regimes of power. Between 1845 to 1917, over 145,000 South Asians migrated to the Caribbean through indentured labor contracts following the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. As bodies extracted in the name of European colonialism, Indo-Caribbean women became central figures to new coolie ways of being, transplanting, remixing, and rebirthing new forms of Indianness. At the same time, the Indo-Caribbean woman also became the site of heteropatriarchal control, No longer was the face of violence only articulated through white hands, as they simultaneously moved through brown grammars and tongues. In her book, Coolie Woman, journalist Gayatri Bahadur notes that during indenture, an overwhelming majority of Indo-Caribbean women's deaths were caused at the hands of kin, those in close relation, and specifically intimate partners. Some of these acts were known as wife murders, where death became the consequence of the surveillance and regulation of Indo-Caribbean women's sexualities, particularly as the mere potential of infidelity, immodesty, or non-respectable behavior was enough justification for their death. Between 1886 to 1890, Bahadur found that the noses of indentured Indo-Caribbean women, representative of women's honor, particularly in the context of Hindu ideology, was a common target for Indo-Caribbean men's hands and cutlasses. It is evident that the violence of the plantation lives on in geographies we now call Toronto, Brampton, Scarborough, Queens, Jane and Finch, and others. Drawing upon the memory of these descendants of indenture, heard and unheard, seen and unseen, let us think about how we are still in a time where our call to action, coalition, and resistance against all oppression demands insurgency. This extends beyond the mythology for the pursuit of liberation for a contained Indo-Caribbean us. Let us reflect upon the strength, resilience, and transgressive force these women carried that colonialism and heteropatriarchal power tried to eradicate, and how their pedagogies of resistance cannot be silenced, even in death. All power structures, including the ones we can and cannot feel, have been built through coexistence, collaboration, and dialogue, whether it be global anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, classism, homo and transphobia, or any other namings and manifestations of the viral pollutant of injustice. May the lessons of these unnoble indentured lives remind us of that collective pursuit.
Thanks so much for playing that film. And I'm really happy that the IGDS was able to host this screening because of the issues that it's dealing with are so absolutely relevant to us today. And yet we are able to pull a historical analysis into this kind of reflection on not only contemporary realities, but what should be contemporary politics. So thanks so much for that. Before we go to Kirby, who is going to bring some reflections, I just wanted to note some scholars and activists who've been working in this field, who are in the room, and also some IGDS graduates. So Dr. Suan Barrett, who is head of the IGDS St. Augustine unit, and Professor Emerita Rhoda Reddock, who is also here, who I mentioned earlier as a pioneer in the field. Anita Baksh, Kavita Singh, Keith McNeil are scholars who have also long been theorizing about Indo-Caribbean gendered relations, gender and sex relations and culture. And it'd be great to have you all in the conversation as well in the Q&A segment. And then also to acknowledge Vidyarata Kisoon, known to us as Vidya Kisoon from Guyana, who's a longtime activist, and also Sabrina Malabaksh from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who will be ending our session. And last but not least, Ashley Burnett, who is the co-founder of Feminitt, who has also joined us. So we're glad to have everyone who has joined us today. And just wanted to acknowledge some of those folks. I left out Asha Maraj, who is a graduate student of the IGDS with her MSc thesis focusing on Caribbean feminist organizing and how to cross and navigate politics of difference. So I think we have a really exciting collection of Caribbean activists, folks, and thinkers in the room for this conversation. We're going to hand over first to you, Kirby, for your reflections on the video, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, everybody. Hello again. I hope you all are hearing me clearly, and I hope you all got to take in as much as I got to take in from the first viewing of that film. And I'm just gonna read out my first thoughts that I jotted down when I first saw it. And I'm saying this is me in the past, first time viewer. I say it goes beyond the awareness of men's violence against women and femininity, and it quickly dives into the heteropatriarchal roots of gendered violence as some of the worst remnants of colonialism. It is a snapshot of the violence, oppression, and unfounded hatred that has muddied the culture of genuine and respected matrifocal communities in both indentured and enslaved laborers in both indentured and enslaved laborers cherished rewind. So it is a snapshot of the violence, oppression, and unfounded hatred that has muddied the culture of genuine and respected matrifocal communities that both indentured and enslaved laborers cherished pre-colonialism. It represents a relevant and urgent need for more open, just like what we're doing now, cross-cultural and intergenerational dialogue about the scars that we are still healing from as former colonies who are yet to receive our reparations. It also stands as a symbol of our resilience that the work of studying and eradicating these wounds is not over. It is proof that there are indeed individuals and communities willing to collaborate to make the necessary changes happen. So that was like a bunch of the thoughts that I had from those 4 to 5 minutes. And I found the film was I think it did exactly what it was supposed to do for somebody like me, who is interested in the advancements that we're making towards ending gender-based violence and violence against women. And the film directly responded to the modern deaths of women and girls across the Caribbean and within the diaspora, whose lives were ended violently at the hands of men, which is a pattern that has been repeated for generations. But it is really important that we recognize that even though it wasn't discussed at length, the influence of heteropatriarchal oppression and violence during indentureship, it affected not just male and female dynamics, but it extended into every single subcategory of relationships that you could think about, based on race, age, class, sex. And it has so much value. The value of the quality of the relationships that women have with other women and that men have with other men affect their perception of other genders. And it was mentioned in the film that it wasn't just violence by white hands. It was now violence by brown or Black people onto fellow brown or Black people. And when we live in a society, we live in a Caribbean, we live in a country. Right now I'm in Trinidad. I've lived here my whole life. I am from a place where it is not odd for a mother or a father to hit or condemn their daughter for loving somebody outside of their race or outside of their religion, for that same parent who is supposed to seek the best for a child to encourage them to stay in an abusive relationship if the person is of the same race for the sake of optics or preserving culture. And when those things happen, the mission of division and separation, as introduced by the colonizers, it continues. When we live in a place where fathers hit and condemn sons for expressing one too many signs of femininity, the mission of the patriarchy persists. And the film touched on that in a way that I don't think I have seen expressed in film before. This is Caribbean storytelling that we need more of. And I am also from a home that has been open about how much feathers were ruffled and how many family ties were cut when my Indian grandfather eloped with my Grenadian grandmother. So when we talk about Afro-Asian intimacies, I have been like totally conscious of how ugly the world is when it comes to how divided its principles could be and how backward the thoughts about relationships and race in the Caribbean. And I think that's one of the most saddening effects of colonialism as well. On top of the violence that it has left behind, it is the leaving behind, well, the loss of culture that we have already experienced as descendants of indentured people and enslaved people. We have also stunted the creation of more unique and combined cultures. And when they say Trinidad is multicultural and cosmopolitan, it is true, but what is also true, because two things could be true at the same time, what is also true is that there is still resistance to race mixing and there are still proverbial lines that can be crossed so as not to upset tradition, so as not to upset culture. And those things are still the result of colonialism, and they are obstacles to our advancement as Caribbean society, as Afro-Asian societies. And just how well and how beautiful life could be if we just combine a lot better, if we are able to be intimate with each other in a safe way, without restraint. And I think of all people, the people who have survived indentureship, who have survived enslavement, who have survived the hatred and violence of colonialism, we deserve softness, we deserve gentle love, we deserve pleasure. And when we limit our possibility for achieving these things, and when by focusing on race and class and traditional understandings of gender, we hold ourselves back and we don't get to find what true freedom and independence really means. And as a young person, I'm 21, I'm turning 22 in December. I'm in my 22nd year, I love that. I am overly conscious of the fact that there are lots of young people in the Caribbean with a lot of old ideas about life and the world and gender and relationships. And that is another waste product of colonialism, where we still think that certain things need to fit in a certain box of a certain shape. Our ideas about gender and gender roles are still warped, and they are the source of a lot of the violence that is inflicted, because we don't understand. We haven't gotten the opportunity to learn more, to understand more, and realize that our ideas about these things are not necessarily our own. They have been left behind by colonialism, and we are yet to form original and progressive ideas about these issues. And one of the most moving and profound moments for me watching the film was when Tifa is shown at the end, existing and expressing both feminine and masculine identities. And I think it sent the message that this issue of gendered violence is so much more than what we think it is. It extends into way more sections of society. We talk about intersectionality and decolonial feminism, and when we do that, we need to keep at the forefront of our mind that the heteropatriarchal violence is not just an attack on women in the traditional sense, it is an attack on femininity and expressions of femininity across the board, no matter who is doing it, who is portraying it. Yeah, it is a hatred for tenderness, it is a hatred for nurturing energy, for regeneration, for true unity and tolerance. And so many of these transformative qualities of humankind have been suppressed due to the patriarchy. They have been called weak, they have been called worthless. And if we are advocating for true change, true justice, and inclusion, we need to unlearn as a Caribbean people. First of all, we need to recognize and then unlearn that our ideas about these things are not, they truly are not our own. We need, like, individually, you need to sit with it, but as a collective, we need to recognize that the sexism, the misogyny, the homophobia, the transphobia, all of those things we have been taught throughout generations, and we have lost so much indigenous knowledge that we don't know that goes so far against what is supposed to be traditionally our way of living as survivors and descendants of indentured peoples and enslaved peoples. So I think we need to really take some time and, reevaluate so that we could truly progress towards gender equity. And I'm gonna end real soon on my reflections, but the last thing I'm gonna say is that the film, I know Premika touched on it, the intention behind the visuals and the things that were used. I'm a creative person as well. Like outside of law and community work, I love art and I love intention behind art. The film showed so much visuals that I think they were moving, like it was intense. The blue back marks, the effect that was done on the nose to represent the violence that was faced. I do think that those images were so authentic, but so detached from our current world. Like that's not a criticism. That's just to say that we live in a time now where abuse is a lot less obvious, a lot less brazen. And if you are conscious of it, you do keep silent. And that is something else that has been left behind by colonialism. Our culture of silence that persists, and it exists with very, very strong basis, which is that people don't report out of the fear of inaction, the fear of further ridicule, further violence, death. And when people don't speak up, or when they don't speak out, or when they don't say that this is happening to them, it is for the sake of self-preservation most of the time. And it works, but it also doesn't. It is also the reason that a lot of these deaths happen, because it seems like nobody is listening. Nobody has hope. But when you look at a film like Gyal, you feel like somebody is listening, that there is a community that is aware, that is looking on, and that is willing to provide the support. So as individuals and as members of this community who want to see progression, who want to see an end to this, we need to figure out how we could prioritize safe and supportive passage for people who are still in these situations. Our systems of justice need to become more trustworthy, and swifter action needs to be taken so that people feel like something is done if they do speak up. So when something like Gyal happens and you see it, you feel like the act of storytelling is finally in our hands, that we could take control of the narratives, whether it's about the negative things that happen or the positive things. It is still in our courts. It was taken from us during colonialism, but we can do something about it now. So yes, I'm really happy that y'all had me here, that y'all gave me the opportunity to see this film and have access to so much more information and knowledge. So that was my reflection on the film. I hope some of it resonated with y'all, and I'll pass it back to Dr. Hosein. Thank you.
Kirby, that was wonderful and real and personal and analytical. Thank you so much. And I hope that Premika and Ryan can engage with some of the reflections that you raised, and also with some of the questions that I'm going to introduce to them as well. So at this time in our session, we are going to go to a conversation with Premika and Ryan, and then we're going to open it up to those who are in the room to join the conversation as well. And like I said, we have a lot of activists who've been working in the field of gender-based violence prevention, and also in thinking about post-indenture legacies. I'd also like to just welcome Shalina Najir, known as Lena Free to some, who has also been working with Red Thread, which is an organization that has really prioritized cross-race solidarities and collaboration in their work. Pauline Bullen, who was at the IGDS, was at the Institute for Gender Studies at the University of Guyana. Krista Danielle, who was part of CWIL, who's been working on issues of women's leadership and transformational leadership as well. And Satira Maraj, who's one of our graduate students. So really just excited, Ryan, and Premika, that although you're not physically in the region, there are a lot of people who are bringing multiple perspectives to this issue that are in the room, who can contribute as well. I want to kick off with some thoughts, and I welcome, and also please put your comments and questions in the chat so that we can just go straight to them, everyone. I wanted to just kick off with some really brief thoughts and some questions for you all. There's been a huge kind of fluorescence of work that is artistic and visual and creative in looking at post-indenture realities, both in the Caribbean and across the diaspora. Work that, like yours, is both beautiful on the one hand, but also is documenting the grotesque on the other. And so if you could talk, I mean, the film is visually stunning and deliberately so, but is also consistently highlighting the grotesque. And if you could talk a little bit, Premika, as well as a filmmaker, about how you managed to get that visual balance. I'm also interested in, and you talk about yourself doing archival dance work, and I'm interested in how in the work that that some are doing, we are finding decolonial ways of, we're creating decolonial archives through creative and performance and dance and visual arts media. And so could you talk a little bit as well about how this film is a kind of decolonial archive, moving out of colonial records, moving out even of scholarly texts, and creating something that is thinking about history and its relationship to the contemporary in your own terms.
Yeah.
Premika and Ryan.
Yeah, I've come to realize when we aired this film in New York City that people consider, I guess, at least from the New York City perspective, that the Indo-Caribbean community at large is very secretive. I'm not really sure why that is or why it's perceived that way. But when people watch the film, they're like, you know, there's a lot here that I didn't know existed or was, you know, was true to your history. And I like to take my art and kind of turn it on its head and push it to a place that, even from an Indo-Caribbean perspective, but even as just a Caribbean perspective, that really pushes it. And so bringing people like Anjali Shiraj, who did the special effects with the noses, making it visual like that, so it's almost tangible, so you can feel it. Having there was a shot of me crawling, holding my nose. I want people to put themselves in the character shoes, regardless of where you are from. So that's important for me to, in terms of decolonizing our history and our art, because I feel like if people are saying we're hidden and we're not sharing who we are, how can I do that? How can I push the envelope on that? How can I get as many people as possible to put themselves in the shoes of the characters, see themselves in them without even, you know, you might be European and not have any idea what happened, but you still feel it when you're watching a character crawl holding her nose, or when she's carrying like the cutlass with the blood on it. You know, all these visual cues are very important. And it's scary at the same time, because you don't want people saying, well, that's not true, which is something that I have encountered a lot within the Caribbean community, the saying that's not true, which is wild to me, because anything is possible. Anything could have happened. So I include that in my work here in Gyal, but also in my other film, Sugar Free, which really pushes the envelope. Kirby actually said it perfectly, you know, violence has changed. And so Gyal, it's very much the physical violence. In Sugar Free, it's the emotional, gendered violence, and how the character through, I mean, it's a comedy film, but like through drugs is how she finds the only way to express herself, that, you know, I don't know who I am and I don't know how to explain it to people without this very extreme step. And so I feel like my films visually always have that within them. Even my dances have that type of pushing envelope, trying to spin it on his head, make it very visual.
Yeah, I can add to that. Hopefully folks can hear me okay. I switched to my phone and I think it's on my end, it's looking a lot better, but please let me know if I cut out or anything like that. Yeah, there's a couple things. First of all, Kirby, thank you so much. That was so beautiful and so generous, and we really appreciate that. It's a running joke between me and Premika. When I originally brought this to Premika, I wanted it to be a 1-minute Instagram video that didn't really, and then she was like, no, absolutely not. It has to be this like big thing that there's so much to talk about. And so seeing the film sort of change and shift has been really cool. But to Dr. Hosein's question, I think that this question of the horrific becomes really important, right? The piece revolves around women that we will never know, right? And so, I'm thinking a lot with folks like, what Black Studies has offered us a lot with Cydia Hartman and other folks, of that there are certain forms of colonial archives that we will never be able to encounter because we're not there and we're not able to go back, right? And I think one of my biggest sort of things I'm contending with, particularly with the Indo-Caribbean community in the diaspora in Toronto, is that there's always this romanticizing of who our ancestors were, right? Me and Premika call this nanny feminisms, right? Naughty feminisms, right? This notion that like all of our ancestors or predecessors were freedom fighters, and they weren't, right? Dr. Hosein has a beautiful essay called, A Letter to Your Grandmother, where you think about a lot of these sort of interconnections and what does it mean to be a descendant of indenture, as a descendant of a historical process with which we actually don't know that much about, right? And so for me, it's not that I need to fill the archive with all the missing details, but again, I want to sit with that unknowingness that there are certain things we will never come to know. I mean, that's part of the violence as well, right? How do we, even at the visual cues, me and Premika were very conscious of the fact that I didn't want these women to look recognizable to us, because this violence is not recognizable to us sometimes, right? The violence that, the colonial violence, neo-colonial violence, oftentimes works through fragments and ephemera, right? It oftentimes works through terms and language and grammars that take us a long time to translate, right? When we think with our bodies, we're not always able to put a term that this is how it's showing up for me. And so even the visual references, we're not meant to sort of project a singular version of what the Indo-Caribbean is. Me, Premika, and Anjali all come also from various different Indo-Caribbean backgrounds. I come from a Presbyterian Christian family. Premika comes from, a mixture of different religious attachments, and then also Anjali as well, right? And so I think, one of the things to think about this sort of intimacy is that to also think about the multiplicity of Indo-Caribbeanness. It's not, as Dr. Hosein and Dr. Uttar talk about in their book, Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, right? Indo-Caribbeanness is multiple, right? Yet what I see in the diaspora is a standardization or an attempt to standardize the Indo-Caribbean. And for me, that's why queerness becomes so central, right? Not just for the folks that identify as queer, but queerness helps us to think with non-normativity and fluidity and mixture and movement. And for me, in my work, I'm situating the Indo-Caribbean as a thing that was always queer. It was relied on queerness to be made possible, right? Particularly in relationship to the colonial presence, but then also to other sort of national presences, right? And the emergence of, a Caribbean nationalism. So with that, the reason I think with tanties a lot or aunties is because for me, they're not the antithesis, but they are really critical archives to think about both pain and pleasure simultaneously, because tanties are not nice all the time, right? They can be awful and they can be mean and they can tell you you're fat and you're ugly. And, we all have those experiences with that sort of tough love of aunties, but they're also some of our most caring people, right? And so I think about my grandmother, who's no longer here, would not have liked that I did this work, right? She would not have liked that I do work on the queerness and, queer and trans communities in the Caribbean. She would have seen that as something that she didn't want for me, right? In leaving Trinidad and Tobago and coming to Canada, right? And again, she was a very staunch, Christian woman. So she had very particular ideas about gender and sexuality, but at the same time, she never vilified me, right? And she held space for my queerness in a way that she knew how. And so I think the film is also helping us to think about that sort of deep entanglement between pain and pleasure that Kirby put so beautifully, is that we're still contending with, right? We're still contending with you know, the violence of the plantation, even if we can't access the plantation in the same way, right? You know, and I even think about, you know, my friend Anthony Lutchman, who was murdered, right? Maria Venus Raj, who was a drag queen from Trinidad, who was murdered, right? I will, you know, never be able to speak to her again, right? But she shows up in very important and critical ways in our lives that help me to remember and to do that work of rememory. That is really critical, I think, for Caribbean feminist politics and Caribbean feminist organizing. Yeah, so I'm still trying to hold space for what can we do with this interstices, or this fixed location of pain and pleasure that for me becomes super central to thinking about Caribbean feminism.
Thanks so much, Ryan and Premika, for that. I want to, before we go to open it up to our audience, I wanted to move us to the contemporary. The film very deliberately, and I think this is such important work, because so much of the assumptions about Indo-Caribbean feminisms is that it's work by and for Indian communities, as opposed to work that Indo-Caribbean people are creating with Indo-Caribbean people, with non-Indian Caribbean people, but also for Caribbean communities and diaspora communities, with a deliberate kind of politics of belonging and crossing multiple kinds of differences and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how the film uses material culture to encourage us to think about anti-violence work across differences of race and ethnicity?
Premika, did you want to go first? But
yeah, I guess because between Anjali and myself, we were involved with the wardrobe component, literally down to the textiles that we decided to use for the film. That is part of like crossing these borders that people sometimes don't even want to acknowledge within the culture itself. Like the fact that, you know, we're using the Madrasi style ramal, which is Madrasi textile, which everybody across the Caribbean has at least wrapped their head, or they've seen their auntie wrap their head, or seen their grandma wrap their head in Madrasi textile at least once in their life, or seen an image. So that speaks to the universality of it.
Sorry, it's so interesting that Kirby's also mentioning her Indian grandfather marrying her African grandmother, or being, and so that idea of how the material culture crosses as well into multiple
exactly. And even the way that the research that I did in terms of like, okay, how am I going to dress these characters? We decided to give Ryan lace, like a lace material, which I don't know if it's used in Trinidad, but in Guyana, you're going to, you know, a Catholic church, you can wear lace on your head. Or even some Hindu events, I've seen older women wear lace and they wrap it in the same ramal style, or they just wear it like a regular orni. So I like to bring fashion into these conversations because it says a lot without having to do anything. And part of it was unconscious. I did want 3 different styles to just give it some diversity anyways. But the style that I wrapped my head in was the way that my great-grandmother, Kulsum, who I'm named after in the film, wrapped her head. But then funny enough, I thought that was just like an Islamic style of wrapping your head. But then funny enough, the Indo-Caribbean side of my spouse, there was a picture, like a black and white picture of their great-grandmother wearing the exact same head wrap. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that, like, you know, anybody can just wrap their head. So it's even just a head wrap, just how you lay your head wrap it says so much, and there's so much to unpack there. And that is something that when we aired this film in the UK, someone had spoken back to. They're like, right away, the textiles are saying a lot. The jewelry is saying a lot. The jewelry I'm wearing is from a state called Orissa, and it's used specifically for Odissi dancing, but because it's so stylistic, I wanted to portray it within the film. But I'm also wearing stones from North India, you know, and using silver jewelry also is a choice there as well, silver versus gold. And what happened to these jewelries when people crossed? Did they even happen? Did it even happen? I've read that people had to give up their jewelry before crossing. I've also read that there were fights over this jewelry, whether it's, a white man trying to claim the jewelry as his own, someone claiming to be so-and-so's spouse, and they're claiming jewelry as their own, and they're literally ripping it off the woman's body. So these pieces actually do speak back to violence as well. And so that's kind of where I am when it comes to the material parts of the film. Yeah.
Ryan?
Yeah, Premika said so much, but I think the one thing I can also add to that is, again, it was not supposed to meant to be recognizable or legible in a very sort of conventional sense, right? When I talk about this film, I always say, even though, all of us are connected to Indo-Caribbeanness, Blackness really sort of also haunts the film in really critical and important ways, right? And so there's that one line in the film that says, this is not just about an Indo-Caribbean we, but helping us to think beyond, right? So even this language of Afro-Asia, I think, becomes really important for us to think about. Because even when we've aired the film, there's been Afro-Caribbean folks that have been made connections to sort of the style of dress, right? And thinking about how these sorts of divisions between the Indo-Caribbean and the Afro-Caribbean don't actually exist in the way that sort of nationalist politics want them to, right? And so also thinking about, the haunting of Blackness that allows Indo-Caribbean people to even emerge on the plantation, right, becomes really important for us to think about. And I think for me, beyond the textiles, it's really this was sort of our emphasis on trying to push this notion that Indo-Caribbean peoples cannot just be doing Indo-Caribbean things and thinking about the Indo-Caribbean as this isolated monolithic entity, right? And we really need, I'm seeing my friend Christine Khan, who's in the audience here, who writes about anti-Blackness in the Indo-Caribbean community. And I think that work is really necessary. And even though our film is not directly heads-on taking that on, it's that erasure that I think becomes really important. And I've seen one comment here asking about erasure and memory and all these sorts of things. And so the textiles are also helping us to think about this intimacy between Blackness and Indianness that produces sort of all of these sort of social formations that we're talking about, from makeup to jewelry to the way people move in the Caribbean, right? When we think about the emergence of the Coolie woman as in relationship to Blackness, right? She becomes othered and queered in a particular sense because she disturbs this sort of South Asian authentic femininity, right? That doesn't incorporate Blackness. And of course, in the Caribbean, the Indo-Caribbean emerges because of its relationship to Blackness, right? It can't exist without it. And so all those sorts of intimacies also sort of show up in the textile as well, that truly push again against this narrative of an Indo-Caribbean for only Indo-Caribbean people, right? Which has never been truth. It's sort of this weird sort of amnesia of who we actually are, right? That uses identity politics and uses, biology, associations to ethnicity and biological ethnicity as a framework of who we are, right? But again, I'm much more invested in sort of these interconnections between us that are necessary to getting us to somewhere else, right, than where we've already been. And so all the aesthetic choices in the film, I think, speak back to that.
Thanks so much. Kirby, do you have any reflections that you want to share before we move to our Q&A?
I think they said so many valid points. I was like, I'm thinking exactly that. But I do want to mention that as we work towards this kind of collaborative effort towards anti-violence across our cultures, across Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean cultures, Douglas cultures, mixed cultures, whatever it is, we need to ask ourselves if we are also contributing to this culture of violence when we do simple things like speaking negatively about ourselves and each other and the language that we use when we like in regular day-to-day conversations. I think there's a lot of self-hate that descendants of indentureship and enslavement we are still dealing with, because when you have been told across generations that a specific shade or a specific shape or feature is not desirable, you perpetuate that violence further onto yourself, onto your children, onto your employees, onto your students. I think all of us here, we exist in many different realms. We interact with many different people, but our relationships to ourselves and those most dear to us, we need to be aware of and just be conscious of that type of stuff as well. That's something that this film really had me thinking about as well, like beyond the physical violence, anti-violence in your language and in your internal processing of life. Yeah.
Those are excellent points, you know, and particularly when you think in terms of continuing things like colorism, even continuing notions of caste. I want to move us directly into the questions so that, and to encourage those who are in the room to put on their microphones, ask a question or post in the chat. And the first one comes from Kavita Singh. And she's asking about the powerful imagery of the fields of the agricultural and country spaces as the backdrop to the women's presences. And she's asking if you could talk about the kind of geographical memory and how one navigates what one says, what one uses, what one carries within us, even as we live in different spaces. And I think this was such an important point, because it's so significant that you are not producing this work in the Caribbean. And you located very much in the Caribbean diaspora of Toronto, in the landscape of Canada as well. And yet there's a familiarity in the domesticity that is cited, the hanging of the washing on the line, things that feel so Caribbean that are also carried into other spaces. And I think it's important to talk about what it meant to produce this work in not cane fields or rice fields or even in subsistence gardens, but in that landscape of Toronto, Brampton, Scarborough, etc. So I think we're going to go straight to Kavita's question, and welcome others.
Go for it, Ryan.
Sorry, yeah, my stand just fell. Yeah, this is a great question, and it was something we spent a lot of time thinking about, because again, this film wasn't original in terms of the film wasn't the medium we were first using to develop this work, but it was through photography. And so actually, the place that we filmed this is in Hamilton, Ontario, which is a weird, interesting connection for me, because that was actually the place my grandparents migrated to from Trinidad. That was the first place they came to. And it's kind of known in Canada as a very white place, a very white geography. It doesn't have the same sort of attachment to Caribbean community as, say, you know, Brampton. If you know Canada, there's certain places in the suburbs. There's a place called Scarborough, which is very sort of important for Caribbean, sort of historic Caribbean movements in Canada. North York, Brampton, but Hamilton not so much. But interestingly, it became really, again, important for us to not have to rely on the literal physical presence of the Caribbean. Number one, because we shot this during COVID. So we actually were on a 13-month lockdown. So even if we had wanted to come to the Trinidad or Guyana, we couldn't. And two, we wanted to also think about, again, how the Caribbean diaspora remakes the Caribbean outside of the, you know, physical borders of what we see as the cartographic map of the Caribbean, right? So even in the film, it was a very conscious choice to have like the maple leaves sort of falling, right? Which is a very sort of, you know, international signifier of Canada in many ways. But also to think about the violence that lives in Canada is produced between these crossings between the Caribbean and the diaspora. So another person I was thinking about, who I actually name in the film, Ria Rajkumar, was, I don't know if folks heard about this, but this was a little girl from Brampton, an Indo-Caribbean girl, I think she was Guyanese, who actually was killed by her father after a dispute with the mother. And one of the ways, again, she was killed was the father killed her first and then killed himself. And a lot of these narratives of misogyny and gendered violence show up time and time again. And I was, you know, thinking with Premika about, why is this so pervasive? And then when you read folks, you know, like Gayatri Bahadur or Dr. Hosein's work, or Patricia Mohammed or Rhoda Reddick, you're reading all these really important Caribbean feminists talking about these acts of violence, which carry a very sort of linear trajectory to the now, right? These are not just contained to the past. And sort of thinking with land and thinking again how land has memory, and thinking about sort of the architectures of memory that are contained within terrain became really important for us. You'll also notice the film has no dialogue except for me narrating, right? And we made that choice consciously because I didn't want it to have a sort of neat and tidy version of this woman is this person and this woman is this person, right? The whole reason is, again, is these women could be anyone, right? They could come from multiple histories, multiple backgrounds, multiple.
Premika, maybe you want to jump in.
Yeah. So my take on this was, I remember when Ryan pitched this, I was like, oh God, how are we gonna find a cane field? Like, how are we gonna do this? And when we pulled up to the location in Hamilton, we were trying to just shoot overall in like beautiful areas, but then there was that one area that it was filled with cattails. And for filming specifically, I decided to use dance postures that are found in Nagara, which is a folk dance style in Guyana. I don't know if it exists in Trinidad. It's very similar, but not the same as Nanchenya in Jamaica. And so sitting with your, I don't know if you guys can see it, with your knees up, with your hands over, the smoking positions, those postures are kind of what brought it's like a physical signal. Oh, plantation postures, right? Which is, it does relate back to, could be slavery, could be indenture. I have a whole piece dedicated to plantation posture. It's called Rasia. So I mean, if anybody wants to see that one, it's a dance, please let me know. But also I think the visuals itself, the location back to Canada, is an olive branch to the diaspora that we see you. We know where you are. We know you're far away. Because I feel like for me, as someone who has had experiences between Guyana and Canada and the Bahamas, there's always we don't see you and you're not here. You're not part of this. And I like to think I wasn't born on this planet to make you feel challenged or make you feel like you are not part of this. And so I feel like having literally the Canadian flag kind of like fall down in front of the face of the viewer, seeing the cattails, seeing the water, people talk about the Kalapani all the time. Well, we live on Lake Ontario, right? So this universality of water and nature, I wanted it to come off as an olive branch to the diasporic people who don't always feel safe or don't always feel accepted by the Caribbean community, but for also the Caribbean community, people living within the Caribbean, to be like, I see this, like these are visual things that if I'm not paying attention to the leaves, if I'm not paying attention to the fact that this is filmed in Canada, that they can see and still connect to it, whether it's through fashion or posturing. So that's kind of where I am in of like the visuals.
Thanks so much for that. I want to go to Camille Naked, who has a question. Camille? Her hand is up. Camille?
Mute. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just start my video. Look, my apologies. Of course, I'm just walking the streets of Brooklyn here. I'm seeing so many queer people I never used to see before, but I just have 3 quick questions. Well, first of all, that was an awesome presentation, and I'm sorry I missed the film. I thought it was 12:30, but it's 12. But from what I've heard, the commentary and everything, it's just fantastic. It's just, I'm just awed by it all. Just a couple of things. What are your thoughts on the, I would say, re-emergence of sort of a religious, or I would say a hostile and duplicitous acceptance of the queer community? In that, what I mean is that it's an acceptance more than it was before, but with conditions about turning back to religion. It's a sort of, we forgive you, but we don't accept you. And there's a strong, it's a duplicitous sort of hostile way of approaching our queer community. Secondly, in I would say Toronto, Brooklyn, etc., there's a large LGBTQ Caribbean community. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I am, it's not. And so the spaces to be is not available. And I wondered what your thoughts on the fact that people, what support is there for parents? Because I think with the Caribbean people, no matter where they are, they do look to the community and what the community thinks, and having a queer family member is not a good thing. What support is there for them so they put their child first before the community? And the third thing I want to ask about the gender inequality, where are we with, I don't know if you've heard the term gender apartheid, but it's a group here, especially to do with Afghanistan, Iran, looking at gender apartheid and how it disenfranchises women in all aspects of it. And is that something that has been broached over here, now that I'm here, in the Caribbean and these spaces here in Toronto, New York?
Thanks so much, Camille. Before we go to answers, I think we should maybe hear a little bit from our audience, and then we can come back to a round. And I see Vidya, you have up your hand as well. So Vidya, why don't we go straight to you? You got to turn on your mic, Vid.
Sorry, hi everyone. Thanks very much, for this opportunity to see the film. And so of course, after seeing the film and hearing the commentary, I think I need to see the film again to process it. So perhaps this isn't so much about the film, but it's interesting you asked about contemporary. So I'm just coming from a conversation this morning about a friend of mine who's a survivor of intimate partner abuse, non-physical abuse, calls me because she met a 23-year-old woman who is a survivor of rape and who is now behaving, who's using alcohol, and her parents are concerned that she's embarrassing them and acting out and so on. And there's no conversation about the rape and surviving rape. And this is like, as I'm watching, so there's something in my head now, something which we haven't done a lot of. And I think it was this image of the three figures the three zombies dancing. And I mean, I appreciated all the conversation about textiles and everything, but it's this idea of the three zombies dancing. And I think Kirby mentioned something about community. And there's something now that, so here, yeah, I'm familiar with, we're very much grounded in the awfulness of our tolerance and acceptance of violence. So like somehow or the other, we got to see hope now. What does healing in community look like? So for example, with my friend, and thanks, and wherever those conversations have happened, so of course I saw the three women dancing, and instead of thinking of, okay, the remind the bloody noses, I'm thinking of other women in Matikor, which some of you might know is that particular dance, the ceremony before the wedding, right? Before the Hindu wedding, the Friday night ceremony. And also thinking of how, for example, like you're talking about tanties, my friend became this unofficial tanty to this 23-year-old woman. And now we were like, okay, and I'm trying to say to her, okay, as an addition to individual therapy, how are we going to build community for this woman? Because we have to build family too, because her family thinks she's behaving bad and she should really, get over this thing that happened to her and not embarrass the family and so on. And so watching this and hearing this conversation, and interestingly enough, one of the options is the space that has been created by a Indo-Guyanese remigrant to Guyana who's tried to create a healing space here in Guyana you know, and so I think I had a little difficulty with Ryan narrating the film because this is about women, and I thought the man's voice dominating was, to me, like in my own space as a man in this space, learning to give privilege to women's and survivors' voices. I just felt that I loved the three figures that, you know, but I just, maybe because it's how literal, but these are the kinds of things that are happening because we're men in these spaces. So like, I kind of like, you know, I was grateful for the, you know, for the beautiful descriptions and that the story, beautiful woman. And we didn't hear you, Ryan, you cut out that point, the beautiful woman without a nose. I sing Ramayana, I'm Hindu and so on. But that imagery that you have there brought up, you know, the work that we're doing around the Hindu festival of Navrat, where some, you know, many activists have like switched, you might have seen those images of the goddesses, the deformed goddesses during Navrat, with the marks of violence on their face, you know, and how some Hindu men said it is not appropriate to deface our goddesses like this during this time, you know, and I watched this. So I didn't think Jumbies, but you know, it was reality. The bloody cutlass hit home the reality. Yeah, that visual was very much there. But abuses, somebody mentioned this, abuse is also happening in so many other ways, which, you know, and deaths are happening with guns now rather than cutlasses, because we also have an interesting thing is the rural, you know, we're not so much located in the rural anymore. So even as we look at the plantation, so those contemporary, I think you had that discussion, it's very much in landscapes which are supposedly civilized. You know, elements of development that we have, running water and inside toilet and all these things and so on. Right. So anyway, so that's just me rambling. Yeah. So I guess I want to ask you about what did you think about healing in the community as you were making your film, or what you know, what can your film offer for that? Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for that, Vidya, the question about healing. And I think the question about the narration is an important one for you to respond to, Ryan. Just to say, we wrap this session pretty much now, as we've been going since 12. So what I'd like from our speakers is that we get a last, not too long response from you, which would give us a minute to allow Sabrina Maula-Baksh, who's the general manager of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, to speak for a moment about the work of the CADV and their fundraising efforts. So I'm just heading back to our panel for a quick round of answers, because no conversation is ever finished.
Okay. I'll let Ryan talk about the narration part, because we did have some back and forth about that. That's actually not the first time someone has brought that up, but I'll let Ryan answer that. I'm going to try and answer all these questions as quickly as I can. I was taking notes. So in terms of religion and queerness, acceptance with conditions. So a lot of people already know this, but I married a trans person who is Indigenous Guyanese. And we've essentially stepped away from religion. However, I find that when I am in Guyana, a lot of these communities like to just not accept these things about me and just want what I can offer, which is Odissi dance, which is, it's not the same pantheon even of Hinduism that, you know, West Indians have come to create and cultivate and protect. It's something completely different. So I find that even when I push back with the Odissi, it's very erotic. It's erotic art. Why are you censoring? Why are you asking for it and censoring it? I completely understand the acceptance with the conditions, because again, you guys know who I married, you just want these things, but you don't want to have the conversation. So it is really difficult. And for that, I had a really big learning curve with that this time last year, actually, where I'm trying to censor myself so I don't get nobody in trouble, but I had to create a dance that would not exist or would be very offensive to Orient people. And dealing with that, also the orders of which you do performances, Mangala Charan in the beginning, I wasn't even put in the beginning. And I was like, so then why am I here? You guys want authenticity, but you don't want it. You want it with conditions and you want to censor these things. This is so silly. But I found that having that mouth saying these things is how I get a lot of violence put back onto me. So I don't necessarily believe that religious organizations, be it within the West Indies, be it organized in New York City or Toronto, that are organized by West Indian people, I tend to stay away from them completely, because again, you are absolutely right. It always comes with a condition and it goes against the grain of who I am and who my family is. And I need to stick up for them, and I need to stick up for myself, because if I'm not starting that journey on my own, who is going to do it otherwise, right? If not me, then who else? LGBTQ, where do we go? I'm still creating films. You can always see what I'm doing on Instagram at Real Prem Shady. Sometimes I'm quiet for a while. It's because I'm in the middle of creating something new, but it always is queer content. It is always diverse. I always try to bring the Caribbean culture, whether or not I say it, it's always somewhere in there, because I don't think it always needs to be said by words. I haven't heard the term gender apartheid, but the disenfranchising of women is still an ongoing thing. It has not changed. It's still exact. I say this a lot, I rely on Ryan a lot to get me into places that I cannot go in, because if I were to say the same things I just said right now to an older man and Ryan said it, it would be much more accepted by Ryan and it would get him farther. And so sometimes I'll be like, Ryan, you said the same thing I said. How come you're getting into this door, and how come you're going to these? And this is not a criticism against Ryan. This is something that we actually joke about a lot, where it's like, oh, you're talking about dance, but I'm the dancer. I'm the trained dancer. I've been doing this for 30 years. So yes, I know, I look like a baby, but I've been in this industry for a long time. So it's still a thing that's happening. It's still very evident within the West Indian culture. The last question that Vidya had brought up was, what does the film offer in terms of healing? Anything that I am doing is a full frontal attack on the community, whether they like it or not. This film was not supposed to make people feel comfortable. They're supposed to be feeling unsettled. This idea of like Sarpanka, with the nose cut off, which I think is what you were talking about in terms of the Ramayana. Well, that was the attack, that was the attack mechanism that was used and documented on these fields. So take a good hard look at what your ancestors have been doing, whether they're directly related to you or not. This is our history. Guess what? We need to start the change now. Same thing in terms of Sugar Free, my other film. Candy is talking about, she wants to express herself, but she literally needs drugs to do so. And she's like, I'm afraid to say who I am, because there's always an attack, whether it's the diaspora, whether it's my own queer community. It's never right. Biphobia, panphobia, all those things. So I use my art as a way to express my rage, quite frankly, whether it's Russia, whether it's Sugar Free, whether it's this. And to talk back to the style of dance that you were seeing, it was Nagara, which was traditionally done by men, but then it was put into Manticore spaces through Tassa music. So just to answer back to that.
Thanks so much, Premika. Ryan, I don't know if you want to address any of the things that Premika didn't really quickly.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I don't know your pronouns, Vidya, and so I'm not sure how to address you with pronouns. But I will say the critique that you are bringing up is a valid one. So to answer very briefly, in a logistical sense, we made that decision, number one, because I wrote the artist statement when we did the photography series. So we sort of talked about what would this look like. But at the same time, too, I think it also is very important to us to think beyond biology, right? Because I think also times a lot.
Oh no, it's happening again.
Ryan, might you come back?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My internet is being awful today. But what I'm trying to say also is that this gendered violence we're speaking of, although it emerges from the place of woman, it also extends itself to homo and transphobia. And so the work of sort of us having the three of us being there together is also to help us to think about, I'm not a woman, I identify as a cis queer man, I don't experience misogyny, but the ways in which misogyny works that extends and uses femininity to attack people also takes up sort of how queer and trans folks get oppressed by these gender ideologies, right? And so I think about having me there, right, with Anjali and Premika becomes really critical to think about what is solidarity in the contemporary period, right? We cannot, live in a world that is of just men or of just women. And so trying to think and again, move through all these vocalities becomes really central for us. And of course, if the film was longer, there would be different aesthetic choices that need to be made. But part of the work me and Premika were also doing is that having to give context to such a short film, right? And one of the ways we tried to do that was with the voiceover, right? We were like, how do we narrate this story, in 4 minutes? And sort of that was one of the methods in which we sort of went with it. But I totally understand your critique. And I think it's also really important for cis queer men as well, to also make space for women, right? Because of the ways in which queer men often take up the most space, right? Whether they're in queer or non-queer spaces. And so it becomes very important for me to do this work with Premika and Anjali, not just beside them, but with them. And so with that, it speaks to the spirit of collaboration and solidarity that we try to sort of cultivate in the space.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Kirby, I'm just going really, really quickly to you just for a minute, if you could please wrap.
Yes. So I just want to end by saying that as a creative person as well, I resonate with Premika with translating a lot of my rage and criticisms about social issues and particularly gender-based violence and all these things through my art. And I think when all of us here continue to translate not just what the past was, but what we want our futures to look like in contrast, we run the positive risk of changing hearts and minds and inspiring people to think about things they hadn't thought about before. So if you're on that journey of translating your activism in whatever way, I think you should continue to do so. It helps us process in a really good way. And yeah, it's bound to move somebody in the right direction. Yes.
Thanks so much, Kirby. Perfect. And I'd like to just now quickly invite Sabrina Maulabaksh to just very quickly introduce the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and also to invite us to support the work of CADV. Sabrina?
Thank you very much. I value this opportunity to be in this space. And one of the presenters made a statement which resonated with me. She said that violence is changing. And that struck me because it's changing, but it fundamentally remains the same. The root cause fundamentally remains the same. And that is the need of one person or one entity to exercise power and control over another. And that is what we've been dealing with. And that is what we've been responding to and leading a women-led response to as the Coalition Against Domestic Violence for over 40 years, founded by two powerful women, Diana Mahabir Wyeth and Radhika Seth. They were responsible for establishing the first 2 shelters in the country for women who were victims of family violence / domestic violence. And so our work continues along 3 streams: the provision of psychosocial support services, secondly, through policy influencing, and thirdly, through our prevention program. As you would appreciate, as a non-governmental organization that does not receive a government subvention, our struggle is real. And so we want to be in a position to continue to do the work that we are doing and to be responsive to those persons experiencing GBV. And, we continue to encourage persons to respond in the ways that they can. Financial resources always remain, a fundamental and real issue for us. And so we do what we can through the corporate sector, through inviting individual persons, if they can, to commit to doing standing orders, maybe to contribute $20, $25 per month. And so we hope to generate, we now generate about 6,000 TT through standing order arrangements. I would like to take it to 10,000. So if we can help in any way towards that, if we know any other persons in the diaspora, who we can invite, to do the same, that will be extremely helpful, because we service and provide client support for over 50 women and children per month, with one senior counselor, one social worker, and a part-time attorney at law. If we're able to expand that, can you imagine what we'll be able to do? So we've just recently concluded a very successful walk/run as a fundraiser, and later on in this year, we will also hold an art show. So these are some of the ways in which we generate the resources to continue our work. So just a plug for, in any way that you can contribute and encourage others to do so. Thank you very, very, very much. That's it. Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you, Sabrina. Sabrina is also a graduate of the IGDS. And the IGDS has a long relationship with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And so we're very happy to put your bank account information details in the chat for those of you who want to contribute or to share them. I am just going to say thank you to everyone who was part of our conversation today, to thank our speakers, Ryan Persadie, Premika Leo, and Kirby Moses, to thank you all for producing this film. You mentioned Andrea Barrett. Andrea Barrett was one of our students in our Men and Masculinities class here at the IGDS. So it's a personal, it feels so personal to us here as well, and not just a woman or a girl who's killed, but indeed one of our own gender studies students. And so this is work in which so many of us around the region are invested. And also to thank you for using, or to acknowledge how important the work you're doing, drawing on indenture in these creative ways to craft the afterlife of indenture, its politics, its solidarities, its aesthetics, I think is incredibly powerful work, and work that I'm interested in. I would like to thank Catherine Chan of the IGDS in particular for supporting this, and to leave you all, for those who'd like to see it again, with the film. Please join our Facebook page. Please check our Instagram, because with those platforms, you can see what upcoming events we have. I'm Gabrielle Hosein. Thank you all very, very much for this session. And Ryan, we hand it over to you to end with the second showing of the film.
Premika did this all on our own. And so, we had to sort of hustle to get this done. So we really appreciate you supporting us. So thank you, everyone.
Dawn DeJoy, Vanessa Bailey, Amwati Gyal, Ria Rajkumar, Stacy Singh, Vanessa Zaman, Christina Sakdio, Ariana Gobardhan, Andrea Barat, Christina Yadram. The names listed here are just a mere fragment of the list upon lists of diasporic Indo-Caribbean women who have been injured, harmed, and murdered at the hands of heteropatriarchal power, whether that be in the form of their parents, community members, or even intimate partners. We know the names of these women not only because we hear about them in the news, but because we have seen these acts of death in multiple forms in our everyday lives and families, oftentimes passing through us generationally, physically, and emotionally, unsolved and unhealed. These forms of gendered, sexual, and racialized violence are not just contained to the realm of the past, history, and that which can be unheard, unseen, or unfelt today. Rather, these harms enacted upon the women mentioned above starkly remind us how the afterlife of colonialism and its violences are not really an afterlife at all, but a continuity, an ongoing maintenance, and a harmful lingering of regimes of power. Between 1845 to 1917, over 145,000 South Asians migrated to the Caribbean through indentured labor contracts following the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. As bodies extracted in the name of European colonialism, Indo-Caribbean women became central figures to new coolie ways of being, transplanting, remixing, and rebirthing new forms of Indianness. At the same time, the Indo-Caribbean woman also became the site of heteropatriarchal control. No longer was the face of violence only articulated through white hands, as they simultaneously moved through brown grammars and tongues. In her book, Coolie Woman, journalist Gayatri Bahadur notes that during indenture, an overwhelming majority of Indo-Caribbean women's deaths were caused at the hands of kin, those in close relation, and specifically intimate partners. Some of these acts were known as wife murders, where death became the consequence of the surveillance and regulation of Indo-Caribbean women's sexualities, particularly as the mere potential of infidelity, immodesty, or non-respectable behavior was enough justification for their death. Between 1886 to 1890, Bahadur found that the noses of indentured Indo-Caribbean women, representative of women's honor, particularly in the context of Hindu ideology, was a common target for Indo-Caribbean men's hands and cutlasses. It is evident that the violence of the plantation lives on in geographies we now call Toronto, Brampton, Scarborough, Queens, Jane and Finch, and others. Drawing upon the memory of these descendants of indenture, heard and unheard, seen and unseen, let us think about how we are still in a time where our call to action, coalition, and resistance against all oppression demands insurgency. This extends beyond the mythology for the pursuit of liberation for a contained Indo-Caribbean us. Let us reflect upon the strength, resilience, and transgressive force these women carried that colonialism and heteropatriarchal power tried to eradicate, and how their pedagogies of resistance cannot be silenced, even in death. All power structures, including the ones we can and cannot feel, have been built through coexistence, collaboration, and dialogue, whether it be global anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, classism, homo and transphobia, or any other namings and manifestations of the viral pollutant of injustice. May the lessons of these unnoble indentured lives remind us of that collective pursuit.
That's it, everyone. Thank you so much. And everyone, have a wonderful day, and good luck with all the work that you may be doing to change the world. Thank you, everyone.